Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you've been caffeinated enough or tatinated, whichever way you prefer. Without further ado, I'd like to start our next session by, let me see if I could press it properly, Aaron Barzey.
Yes.
Does that work? Okay, cool. Aaron brings a lot of experience from different companies, from Celgene, GSK. I think there's I can't even go through the list.
Yes, there's more than 10.
So
Johnson & Johnson, GSK, Indivior, RB Pharmaceuticals, Celgene, Sanofi Aventis. The list goes on.
Right, so hopefully he will tell us what not to do, having seen what's been done in these companies, or maybe what to do. It does obviously enriches the experience. I won't go into too much of your details. I think it's there just for the sake of time. We want to hear what you're saying more than what...
Yeah, so I've consulted at multiple companies over my career in regulatory affairs, medical affairs, pharmacovigilance and so on. I'm currently now consulting for Indivior as the global manager for labelling, managing the US office and the EU office in London. So that's a bit of a commute. And so I set up my own separate consultancy to allow me to do these talks without having to go through a copy approval process in the company I'm currently consulting for. So today I'm going to talk about how to organise and implement company core data sheets. I'm aware that it's already been explained today what a company core data sheet is, but I did feel that I did need to have a slide explaining just in case it wasn't going to be covered. Company core safety information. Some companies have two documents. So some companies I've been to have a company core safety information document separate to a company core data sheet. Some have a CCSI so that they can submit it with their PSURs as the reference safety information, because you don't technically have to submit a CCDS, you have to submit reference safety information. The problem with having two separate documents is maintaining them and maintaining harmonization, and whose responsibility is it to look after the CCSI and to look after the company core data sheet. As a previous speaker has mentioned, you do need to have ownership in the documents. And safety like to have ownership of the CCSI, but if you have a global labeling team, they want to have ownership of a company core data sheet. Some companies, though, have one document as a company core data sheet, and they distinguish what they consider mandatory text or CCSI by either highlighting it in grey throughout the text or double underlining, so that when you look at the document, you can see indications is in normal text, because indications can be modified per market because your regulators will put restrictions and so on. And the indication should be the broadest your company feels your product provides efficacy to a patient. In 4.8, with adverse reaction terms, that would be highlighted grey to distinguish that this is the company's position on this actual event, and every market needs to at least try to have this in there. Some do underline, some have it in red. Don't really like colours because some markets print out and they don't have colour printers. Actually, some markets don't have colour printers. Sounds very funny. But in this world, not all markets have the facilities. Like there was one particular market in Africa which they have to print out all their documents for other people in the department to have a look at. And they had a very old 1990s printer. CCDS creation. Hopefully, a developmental company core data sheet should be available based on the target product profile. So that would be constructed in the beginning, highlighting what you actually want the product to be used for, what you're aiming for in your clinical trials, what direction you're going, and to focus your company for this particular product, because it's very important in developmental to have a focus. Investigator brochure, which is mandatory, or involving documents, target some of your product characteristics or USPI, because you do, in the United States, normally have a target product profile to aid you in your discussions with the FDA. The global pharmaceutical marketplace. I've put up lots of flags up there just to highlight that it's a very large world out there. We have lots of different markets. There is no harmonization with these markets. One particular country might feel that an indication that you submit is fine. Another one will want it to be combined with therapies. Another one will just say, no way. How do we manage this? Global pharmaceutical top markets. Now, this is from a study in 2014. The data is old, but I've put this up there to show you that you can't focus on one market. I remember I consulted at one company. I went there, they just focused solely on the US market. When you're a multinational company, if you only consider one market, you're putting yourself at risk of regulatory changes and changes in market from the long term. If you can see here from 2011 to 2013, the growth of one particular country has stayed the same, United States, whereas Japan was minus 16, Japan has gone down, and China has gone up from 16 to 22%. So if you're looking for growth, you need to consider the world, not just one particular market. How can we manage medicines globally? Global Labelling Committee or Board to certify the company's position. I'm going to go into that further later. The individual company, product, and market needs to be considered. Local operating groups, affiliates, contract research organizations, and vendors. Now, the bottom line is very important when you're a multinational because you can't always have an actual employee or an office in every market that you're pushing out for. So you make contracts with CROs or local vendors so that they will facilitate your application in that country, because you would expect them to have the local expertise. You'll expect them to hopefully have a relationship with the market that they're based in, which will aid in your progression and implementation of the CCDS. If you're a large company, you may have local operating groups. So that's a smaller version of your own company registered in that market. What is a global labelling board? Some companies have global labelling boards, which tend to be a group of multinational, cross-functional individuals, subject matter experts, who would discuss on a periodic basis whether it's new product development, new applications, variations to existing products, and maintenance. So, for example, one company I worked at, which is the third largest in the world, their global labelling board consisted of a person from legal, a multi-group of people from the United States, Europe, Australia, China, so on, pharmacovigilance, medical affairs, corporate affairs, regulatory. It sounds like a lot of people. It is. You'd have a telephone dial-in for people who would dial in. You'd have a web login, and you'd also have a meeting in the office. So I remember once when I was a lead for an oncology, global labelling lead for an oncology product, and I was proposing a new indication. I would sit down in the office. My team would have presented all the information, all the data set in advance for the global labelling board to receive and review. It would be a question and answer session. They would give us recommendations, what changes, and then afterwards it would be certified. The company core data sheet would be certified as the company's position on this particular product. From then, you would then send that information off to the markets for it to be filtered down, which I'll show on later. So the global labelling board for large companies will certify the company position. It's very important that these meetings are minuted. Why? Because as when we spoke about PRAC earlier, there was a situation with one company that I worked for where PRAC mandated that for the European license, we had to have a contraindication. The company did not believe that contraindication was valid. So, because PRAC has oversight of Europe but not the entire world, the contraindication goes in the EU SBC. At the next Global Labelling Board meeting, the information PRAC had provided to us was discussed. All the clinical and safety information was discussed. The safety team are present, the clinical team are present. You go into a thorough discussion of each of the data, and the company decided that there was no causality and there's no reason to have the contraindication. That is minuted there, it's documented and published. If an inspection comes in and they say, if the Americans say, why Does this contraindication exist in Europe but not in ours? Well, these are the minutes, this is what we discussed, this is the rationale, these are the documents that we discussed there, and this is the company position. And then in that situation, the FDA looked, they said they agreed, they thought the EMA was being overzealous in their exact words. But it's also important to note that when we did communicate with the EMA, legally we said we reluctantly agree to include the contraindication. If you say you agree from a legal perspective, that means you agree, not reluctantly agree. What needs to be considered after the CCDS has been approved at the Global Labelling Board and so on? Oh, I'd just like to note that not all companies have global labelling boards. I did consult at one company where it was just myself, my boss, and the CEO, and that was the chain of command. What needs to be considered? Waves. So what you need to understand is you have a very large marketplace, and some markets are reliant on other markets. So that's why we have waves. For example, if you're going to apply for a new drug in Mexico, you will get an accelerated approval process if you have your license from the EMA or the FDA. So you think to yourself, well, do we submit our whole clinical package to Mexico, or do we wait for it to be approved by the EMA or the FDA? So then you would normally do wave 2 for Mexico, for example. And some markets require it to be, you have to have a license in a major market like the US, Australia, or Europe in order to even apply for a license. So wave 1s normally include the US, Europe, Australia, and so on. And how do you know this? Well, once you send out the company core data sheets to the markets, you should have a flow of communication with your vendors, CROs, or local operating companies who will say to you, well, we do understand you want us to submit this new product or this safety variation. However, we must have a copy of the certified EMA EU SPC first. And then you note that, and then you change it to wave 2 if you didn't know that in advance. This is a diagram I drew last year for a company who were expanding outside of one particular market. They wanted to know how they were going to implement and manage their company core data sheets once they've actually made them, because they didn't actually have any. So this was the best way that I could explain it. Unfortunately, you can't really see this line here. So you've got your global labeling board, your global labeling team, global regulatory affairs, receive the certified company core data sheet with the accompanying data. You send that around to the markets and stakeholders. Stakeholders would include the investigators because they do need to be informed of such things. And then you would close out from a global aspect. Now, the regions, so the markets, so let's say that was your US contact, your European contact, your Algerian contact, would then inform you that they're not going to submit, or they are going to submit, or they're going to delay submission. Now, you might think, why are they not going to submit? Well, not all countries have pharmacodynamic sections. So if it's a K or PD update, they're just going to say, we don't have that section, it's not applicable to us. Or, for example, the PRAC recommendation that I just said about contraindication, if you had included it as a warning as a precaution because at your boardroom you decided it's not a contraindication, but we should put it in warnings and precautions just for openness and so on, when you submit it to Europe, what are they going to say? They're going to say no, because we have it as a contraindication, which is a higher level than a warning and precaution. And then you just get the ones which are just going to say yes. So then you submit to your health authority, and RFI means request for further information. And this is in a dotted line in between, purposely, because there needs to be a flow of communication between the regions and global. This is very important for a CCDS implementation, because you can't have regions agreeing to stuff without global having a review process of it. Now, this is not to say that we don't trust the markets and so on, especially when they're internal. It's just to make sure that the company position, which is the CCDS, is maintained. And it's also to make sure that we are aware of the communications and the requests from health authorities and so on. Also provide them additional guidance. So at this particular step, you may get, the market says, well, should we just agree? No, we should reply once with the data to support our company position, because from a legal perspective, if you're just going to agree first time round, why is it not in your actual company position? So you'd send off at least one request saying, we don't agree, we understand your point of view, however, this is our point of view, and then reluctantly accept afterwards, if it came back. There has been cases where health authorities have agreed when you've provided further information, when you've provided more than just the clinical safety report, you've provided a whole complete data set to support your opinion. Japan, I remember having a question from Japan which went on for a year. They asked us to do additional studies. They asked for data that I've never even considered. And that was one of the most trying RFIs ever, because they wanted a complete review of multiple products which came from one company. So it had a knock-on effect. With the RFIs, you also need to register agreements to make sure that you are aware of deviations from your regional registered product information, your SMPC or whatever, to the global one. Why? I remember once receiving a letter from the Saudi FDA asking for a particular warning precaution to be inserted into the package insert. Why? Because they were looking at the USPI, and the FDA had mandated for text to be put in there. It just makes it easier if you know where the text has come from, because then when you reply, you can say, we are aware that the FDA did request this, we didn't agree with them, and this is the position. Then you go down. Your request for an update or thing can be rejected. You can close out. Can be approved, implemented, and closed out. Here's the slide on requests for further information. Health authorities often respond to submissions with an array of questions, some foreseen and some not. This is good. This is very important with new drug applications and new indications, because you've got to understand you've got timeline. Time is money in regulatory affairs. You need to get it approved as soon as possible. That's why it's very important to you try and figure out what the health authority is going to ask in each market. And that's why you also rely on regulatory experts and medical experts from that particular region. Your health authorities also request further information and or changes to the registered product information outside of submission. So, as I just said with the Saudi FDA, there was no submission for this product in Saudi Arabia. They were doing a periodic review of major markets' registered product information. They did a comparison of the USPI and the EU license, even though their license was based on the EU. And then they noticed text in the USPI and they wanted that included. So you do get questions from health authorities out of the blue, which you do need to make sure you have a link between your local market and global to manage that. Your response to such questions may influence the final product, registered product information, and may have a knock-on effect with other markets. So if you agree with something in Europe, you need to realise that if you have contraindications or warning precautions which you don't agree with, that you don't believe is beneficial to patients or prescribers, if you have it included in the EU SPC, the trickle effect is once it's published in Europe, the emerging markets which are reliant on the EU SPC will then see that, and it will have to be included in there. For example, French SPC is used for Morocco, and so on. Implementation. The implementation of a CCDS is a dynamic process which requires adequate training, tracking, and to ensure timely implementation of CCDS information into local labels. I've had various opinions on what you consider implementation. My personal opinion on implementation is when the last stakeholder person is trained, so let's say the last sales rep has been trained on an update or a new product, and when the supply chain is starting to print the new pills, patient information or packs. That's actual true implementation. You can have it staged out if you want to, like a relay. So global, their implementation is when they hand it over to the markets. Regional regulatory affairs is when they hand it over to medical affairs, like a relay system. You can have broken up implementation. But generally, my opinion is implementation is when the last relevant person has been trained, and when the actual new patient information leaflet, if it's been printed, is being printed out. Translations. This is something you need to consider when you're doing your company core data sheets and sending out timelines and so on. Local labels transitions are also required, as the local label might not be available in English. In one particular company, when they updated their regional SPC, because they don't have anybody for that particular language, they have to submit the company core data sheet to a vendor who will then send back a current English translated version. They will then include how they want the text to appear in that local market. They will then translate it back into the local market's language, submit it to their health authority in that local language. It will then come back from that regional office, come back to the vendor from the health authority in the local language, then be translated back along with the questions and then back to you for your review. So that's quite a long process. I know in Europe, when you're doing the centralized procedure, there's strict timelines and translations. So it's good to inform your vendors, your local markets in advance of the changes you're going to implement. Don't drop it on the door on the last day. Especially with the European centralized procedures, you'll miss your timelines. Errors occur when people are rushed. I remember for one company, one particular market in Europe missed out a combination product in the indication of a new indication because the timelines were so rushed. So the whole new indication being sent out was wrong in one particular market in Europe, and it was quite an embarrassing thing to have to go back to CHMP. So what you can do with translations, you could do at-risk translations where you would inform your vendor, this is what we believe the text is going to look like. We're still in discussions with the health authority about this. This is the company's position. This is what we believe the EMA are going to say, or this is what we believe is going to be accepted. It's going to be at risk. Please be aware that the actual final opinion will be out on this date. So to give them a bit of time. Implementation date is the date the last relevant staff member has been trained. That's what I said. It's my opinion. It's also the implementation is the first batch of the product is released to the new information. I did have a discussion with one person in supply chain who believed the implementation date is actually the date of the expiry of the last batch with the old product information, because it still technically can be sold in pharmacies, so a patient could still be getting the old patient information leaflet unless you do recall. I don't agree with that, but everybody has their own opinion. It's not set in stone. Yes.
So in UK, for example, it's released about 2 weeks, so you have to take this also into consideration.
Yeah, that's why I did state my opinion.
Yeah, it's for
Yes.
the others who are not aware.
Yeah.
Authorities have also their definition of implementation, and you have to take these above all into consideration before your internal content approval.
Yeah, and there isn't across the markets there is no harmonisation what they consider implementation, and the whole implementation dates. I remember one company had one set date for company core data sheet change implementations globally, which was not achievable. They weren't aware that some markets have to have an approved EU state SPC before they can even submit. They didn't understand that some markets have to publish an updated SPC within 10 days of getting the approval from their market. Like in the UK, you have to put it on the EMC website within 10 days, but that's not cross everywhere. So they've taken that regulation and applied it to every market. But then some markets, like we don't have an electronic repository online. So why are we being told that we need to do this? That's why you need to have one particular SOP for your global and separate ones for your regions if you're going to implement a CCDS, because if you're going to write all these rules and regulations for the markets and they're unachievable, they're not going to pay attention to your global team, because they'll just do their own thing. And then when you get an inspection, you realise they're not actually following your SOPs, and you put yourself at risk. So that's why you need to separate them out. It's a lot to dip per market. Tracking of progress and status. Tracking is quite a complicated process. There are databases such as Opal, RMT, and Portal and TrackWise, which can track the progression, submission, and non-submission of your updated product information. I've used Opal and TrackWise before. You would go into the system, you'd have different people have different responsibilities to update where their progress is, and then you can get an audit report for your Global Labelling Board meeting. So, for example, I'm going to a Global Labelling Board meeting in November, where we will discuss the progression of a particular safety change around the world. But with that one, it's in an Excel spreadsheet, and we individually contact the markets and update the Excel spreadsheet in advance, because the database, because they haven't bought a database yet. So you can use Excel spreadsheets, but that relies on you having a good communication flow with your vendors, regions, and local markets. And it also requires people power to enter in all that information and accuracy. Because when you discuss it at the Global Labelling Board, the tracking progression will be noted in minutes. When you do have inspections, they do ask you, when did you notify this? When did you find the signal for safety change? When did you decide to include it? What was the review process? When was it implemented? And having a nice Excel spreadsheet will say, you know, it was submitted to the national EU licenses on this date, and it's still in progression. Supply chain, I have previously discussed about varying views on supply chain's implementation. So if you've noticed, you'll have two branchings of an implementation, staff training, sales reps, so on, and then also supply chains of the actual product. Training. With new products and some product updates, various members of staff, stakeholders, and vendors will need to be trained. So you can have online training with an electronic signature to record completion. So you could just have, let's say it was the Australian product information and you had included a new warning precaution. You could have that highlighted in yellow on the text there. The sales rep pops up, read that this has changed. They sign off, electronic repository. It will be tracked in an electronic system because there are like one particular software called LMS will track it for you, and you can find out who on the list of stakeholders for a product hasn't completed the training and who has. You can do group presentations with registers. So I did training on a administration process for an oncology product. We had a group of 20 people in the room. With a register. The register was uploaded, and some nice person in IT uploaded it into an electronic repository for me. And that way, you get multiple people trained up, and that's the implementation for that particular update. Now, I'm going to go on to variations in strategy, organizations, and implementations based on my own experience. So there's one particular example, which is the consumer healthcare acquisition. So a consumer healthcare company acquired another consumer healthcare company. It had a group of at least 10 consumer healthcare products, which were quite old. They had it in multiple markets, but it was found out they did not have a company core data sheet, which meant there was no harmonization. And when the IMB found out that the Irish product information was out of scope with one of the other major markets, they stopped them from selling the products on the shelves. So we had to make company core data sheets out of the 3 existing SBCs and also find out if there was any class effects and so on, and then submit it out to the market. So that's one way that you would have to do implementation backwards. So you were taking what was out there, taking what should actually be in the labels, amalgamating into one document, and then updating the SPCs afterwards. Legacy product maintenance. Sometimes products which are very old came out in times when the company was just a national organization and they've branched out, and they want to expand beyond their originator market. So one particular company I consulted for used the UK SPC as the default company core data sheet. They just changed the formatting a bit, and that was how they made a company core data sheet. New orphan drugs. Orphan drugs, you can get registered with phase 2 clinical trial data. So the creation of a company core data sheet starts earlier because you don't have to do phase 3. And you need to be aware that you can submit to the FDA and the EMA in a joint form for orphan drugs. So the application process for the FDA and the EMA will be quite similar, so you need to make sure that you're heavily involved in both of those labels at the time of making a CCDS. When I worked in an orphan drug, I attended a lot of late-night USPI meetings and the EMA meetings just to make sure that Europe and Europe and America were going along the same path, because we did apply at the same time along the joint form which you can get. Creating a CCDS from registered product information I just spoke of, which you can do in legacy product maintenance. I think that's it. Questions?
Thank you. Spot on time. Thank you very much. Okay, we got time for a couple of questions. Quickies. Yes.
I'm going to vet that one.
I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on the scope of the Global Labelling Board and maybe talk a little bit about how it might overlap or where it should be different from your Safety Review Board?
Well, you would have your EU QPPV in your Global Labelling Board, and the safety people would be present as well. So there is an overlap. When you have the safety team review signals and they've decided that there's a causality and so on, they would be providing, well, for one particular company, the safety team would be the originator of that. It does make the flow of a CCDS update easier because the safety team are heavily involved and they would already have looked at it. However, what I do know from previous experiences that sometimes the Global Labelling Board have decided to make a warning precaution a contraindication because they've decided that they will go on an extra form of caution, and that was done on a regulatory basis.
Okay.
But yes, the safety team are definitely involved. The EU QPPV is involved. The head of safety. Safety is a large component of global labelling boards,
Okay.
to my knowledge.
Okay, and just another question about the Global Labelling Board. You talked that they would review the CDS. Would they also be involved in reviewing, for example, your EU and US product information, or would it be purely the company position at the Global Labelling Board would be interested in?
Good question. It would be the company core data sheet in the beginning because that's the company's core position. However, in the review process of you submitting to the EMA or the FDA, and the EMA doesn't agree or they want additional warnings and precautions and so on, because that has an impact on the registered product information and it will have an impact on the registered product information for other markets, you will flow back to the global labelling board / team. That's why it's over there. So when the EU label is being reviewed, when I was doing a new indication for a European license and the EMA came back with restrictions and so on, first thing I did was I sent an email to the head of the Global Labelling Board saying, this is what I've got back, I need to apply by this date. Okay. And you can have ad hoc meetings, or they would just send around an email, or they would just send back an email saying, we agree for you to include that in the European label.
Okay.
You would expect the Global Labelling Board to have an oversight of what's included, which is out of scope of the company core data sheet, which is the inclusion of a contraindication, inclusion of a warning precaution. However, if what the EMA is, if what is being requested by the health authority is within the scope, is narrower, then you don't really need to, or if it's in the spirit of the text that you've put.
So it's only really if it's a deviation that you'd be bringing it back.
The real difficulty was with the FDA, because FDA meetings are on the spot during phone calls, and you just, the US contact normally just sends a summary after the meeting. With Europe, we take our time a lot more than the US does.
Yeah, I was going to say some markets can be challenging in terms of timelines, not only US, but places like Korea, for example, where you've got to react very quickly. You know, it's interesting. Okay, thank you.
One more really quickie. No? If not, then are you in this afternoon?
I'm going to be here for lunch, and then I'm going to the other. I'm presenting at the other conference,
Okay.
so I'll leave that. I think it's my 1:30.
Any
Thank you for listening.
urgent question or topic? No?
Okay.
Thank you very much, Aaron. Thank you. You didn't ask me. Do you want to pass them on now?
Yeah, might as well.
Okay, just tell them what it is.
This is a process map, which I'm not allowed to put in the slides because we got a meeting of people in the US and Europe to show what's actually going on. Because when I started the company, there was no agreement on how they actually implement CCDS. So we got the European regions all together in one meeting. They did this one, what's actually being done in the US. If you want to put it in the slides, we can have a look at it to see the process.
Do not copy, right? Right, ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker, Anna Paul. Anna is started